early morning hours of darkness, when the prosperous Napa Valley was still asleep, this room often glowed with a warm light, as God's messenger sat alone writing letters, articles, and books. But what about Ellen as a person? Because she devoted so little of her creative talents to autobiography, the many facets of her personality and lifestyle are relatively unknown. But fortunately, there's a small number of Adventists whose memories stretch back to the early years of this century who can say, yes, I remember Ellen White. As you read the writings of Ellen White, affectionately referred to by Adventists as the Spirit of Prophecy, one fact becomes immediately obvious. Ellen loved her Lord and His Word supremely.
My name is Evelyn Grace. They wanted me to have the same initials as grandmother, but I didn't keep the white too long. The Sabbaths that we enjoyed the most was the Sabbaths when grandmother was going to speak, maybe in Napa or Calistoga, or some of the churches that would take an early morning drive. We went with horse and carriage then. We got up early. My mother would know Friday before that grandmother was going to speak somewhere else, and she would put up a nice lunch. Now, we could have been invited to people's homes, but when Ellen White spoke, she used a great deal of energy, and she needed to relax after she spoke, which she could do with the family and not with strangers or in other people's homes. So we would take a nice lunch, and if it was a warm day, we'd find a place by a stream that was nice and shady. We'd unhitch the horse, spread our blankets and quilts and cushions, and put down the tablecloth, and Mother would have a nice lunch for us.
And there was especially I remember in going to Healdsburg, where the road was so narrow, you know, by the creek there.
Mother never liked it.
We always held our breath because there was no way of passing. If a team came, it just wasn't too good, and backing a team of horses on a narrow road isn't much fun.
We loved to hear her speak, and she used a great deal of energy when she spoke. You didn't go to sleep when Ellen White spoke.
It was so unusual to hear see a woman at that age with such a wonderful voice, penetrating voice, and a musical voice. It was remarkable.
Yes, I knew Sister White in this way. I heard her preach once and saw her, of course. It was in Boulder, Colorado, at the camp meeting in 1909. In a building with an iron roof right at the base of the Red Rocks there. It's on the campus of the University of Colorado. And she was there. I suppose there were 200 Adventists, and maybe the rest of 1,000 people or 800 people were just the people of the town, people of various denominations that wanted to see the Adventist prophet. I can remember when she came on the grounds in a surrey drawn by 2 horses, and Willie White, her son, was with her, and Miss McIntyre, her companion and nurse. And the meeting that night, she preached to us. I was sitting at her left hand about, 15 feet from her. Could see her plainly, of course, right there. Platform was about a foot and a half high. And she had this big, thick Bible. She was preaching faithfully, giving God's message. And I was interested. It was interesting. She was just a dear, sweet Christian mother or grandmother telling us what we ought to do. Just as she started to talk to finish off, it started to rain on that iron roof, and you can imagine. Now remember, no amplifiers in those days, except you carried your amplifier with you. And she had a regular preaching voice, and you know, from this conversational tone or voice that she'd been using, she went into her real preaching voice. And you could hear her voice just like a silver bell right through all of that confusion caused by that rain. She could talk right through the rain noise. And then she talked just about a minute, and then she kneeled down to pray. She told her son, I must pray for us. And she came over on my side of the platform and kneeled down to pray. I can hear her now. She said, not our Father, but oh, my Father. And from that moment on, it was a personal communion between her and the Heavenly Father. In just a minute or two, there seemed to be a mighty power come over that meeting. And I felt it. I was just a boy, and I was a member of the church. I'd been baptized about a year and a half before. And I could feel that power until finally I was afraid to look up for fear I'd see God standing right there by. She was talking with him. She'd forgotten all about us. And she was in the presence of the Lord. And a minute or two more went by, and that whole crowd, you could hear them weeping, crying over their sin. A tremendous revival, really. Spiritual revival, that mighty power of God. When she preached, God blessed her as a preacher, but when she began to pray, he honored her as his prophet before the people. I'll never forget it.
And in a group, like a group of the family, she didn't talk a great deal. She didn't dominate a room as you might think she might. She took part in conversation. She was not a recluse, but she did not dominate the situation. She just enjoyed being with her family.
Everyone enjoyed eating at Ellen White's table. It was a well-supplied table with fruits and grains and vegetables and nuts, many of them the products of her own home farm here. No tea or coffee were served there. No meat was served there. Meals were served at 7 o'clock in the morning and 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Then if individuals cared to do so, they could go to the pantry in the evening and get a light supper.
One day, a young man came to the front door all alone, a very boy, so Miss McInturfer told me, and she was agreeably impressed with him, asked him a few questions, and she liked the boy. And he would like to know if he could have a little visit, short visit with Sister White, and if possible to have a little lunch with her. So Sister White agreed. Sister McInturfer agreed. She was a very cautious woman about some things. And so he came in, and noontime they sat at the table, and they enjoyed it, and they had a little chat, and Sister White spoke to the boy, asked questions, and so on and so on. And it came to dessert time, and they had, I think it was lemon pie. And they soon discovered that the cook had made a little mistake, because, you know, sugar and salt look very much alike. And it happened to be salt, and a little too much salt in the lemon pie. But they ate it, and didn't advertise it, didn't make any remarks over it. And Sister White, knowing boys, you understand, she raised two boys to manhood, decided to give this boy her piece, and she pushed it over. So he had 2 pieces of pie, well salted. And so afterwards they had a little laugh over it.
Well, she would drive through the countryside, and if she knew of a family that was in need, they would take fruit or breadsticks, something to show that she was neighborly and thinking of them. There were nearly 2,000 prune trees on Grandmother's land.
Where?
We sent some prunes to Fiji, and I remember we even sent some to Russia.
Yeah, and
Lots of prunes.
What do they do with the prunes?
Well, they dried them. How? Well, of course, you have to pick them up first.
Yeah, I remember that.
Which you didn't like to do. But Arthur couldn't see any prunes. So I picked up a little pathway to the middle of the prune tree, make it like a
Yeah, I remember that.
pie,
Yeah.
slice of pie, and I said, now can you see that? And you thought you could. So I said, pick them up. So you did. And that would make about a quarter of a bucket full. And then you'd sit in the top of the bucket and tell jokes. And you'd laugh so hard at your own jokes that you'd fall over and spill them all out. And by that time, my patience had worn out.
And what did you do?
I got a little switch, and I said, you pick up those prunes. Kind of a hard taskmaster, wasn't I?
Yes, you
but
were.
you loved me just the same.
I did, and I still do.
Oh, good.
Have you ever wondered how Ellen made her clothes appear attractive and feminine? Photographs of the early 1900s lack enough clarity to answer such questions, let alone reveal whether the subject was serene or quick-tempered, somber or quick-witted.
I once was bold enough to ask if any here, Miss McIntyre and so on, ever heard Sister White scold anyone. Or was she ever upset, as we say, frustrated, disturbed? And the answers were all no.
Well, just once that I remember, personal advice for me was when I was a teenager. My closest friend was one of the doctor's daughters, and she had nicer clothes than I had, which didn't bother me very much, except I wanted them as short as hers were. They came to her knees, not quite. And we were visiting grandmother, my mother and I, and she looked at me, and we were standing by her chair there, her writing chair, and she looked at me and she said, "May, Grace is getting to be a big girl now. Her dresses should be a little longer." And that's the last thing I wanted. I wanted them to stay short, like my friends' dresses, but they got longer. She had a silver pin with a little flower engraved in it, and little silver knobs all around it to decorate it. She also had a cameo. She had several pins that she used. She did not seem to be against, what shall I say, utilitarian jewelry, if she could call it that. I wouldn't really call it jewelry or not, but she was not against that. And she also wore her watch, which was a Swiss watch, and they made a little pocket in her coat for it. And there was a chain made of her own hair that they in Switzerland wove for her. The end was silver with a few silver links, then her own hair, and then the little chain went through and then over into the pocket on the side. That sort of broke the monotony of the front of her dress, but she did have all these little buttons down the front and a nice brooch at the throat. We were always interested because the folds were black from these gray mothers, but of course they turned gray later. Well, one of them had a little coat, and grandmother wanted to see it, but it was raining. And as she was preparing to go, Miss McIntyre said, "Oh, you mustn't go out, Mother." Now, Miss McIntyre was no relation, but she called her mother. "You'll get your feet wet." "Oh," she says, "I have my galoshes." "Yes, but it's raining. You'll get wet." "Well, I have a raincoat and an umbrella." And whatever Miss McIntyre said, grandmother had a good answer for her, and she went out and saw.
She wasn't easily stopped when she.
Well, she wasn't afraid of snow or rain.
She prided herself at the age of 83 of being able to climb these stairs as readily as any member of her household.
Well, Brother James told me that she was, as he put it, the soul of wit. Said she never was silly in anything, but she was quick on the trigger and seeing points, and laughing about it. And she believed a good laugh was good for the soul as well as for the body. And she'd pick up things quickly, and if you look for it, you can see a shadow of it in her writings in some places.
Ellen White loved trees, and she loved particularly this old live oak tree. It grew to a point where the branches spread clear out almost to the house. And one day my father came out of the office door and noticed that his mother was standing by the open window looking out at the tree pensively, and he came over to the window and he said, "Mother, what is it?" He thought perhaps she was heavily burdened with some problem, and she said, "Well, Willie, I was just wondering whether we were going to have to move the house or whether we were going to have to move the tree." You know how it is when you get through speaking and you go out and the people stand and talk and stand and talk and pretty near wear you out. And the kids were getting a little bit rambunctious and a bit restless, and someone mentioned something about their stubbornness, And James White looked over at Ellen and said to the people, "Well, you can see where they got it." And she responded, "Well, at least I didn't keep it like you did." And so...
no, I never heard that one.
You never heard that one?
No.
Books and magazine articles, letters of encouragement and guidance came from Ellen's pen in an incredible volume. In all, over 25 million words. What human mind could generate such a library with total unity of thought? The answer lies in the source of her inspiration, visions from God.
About 2,000 visions were given to Ellen White during her 70 years of service. In the earlier years, these were often accompanied by physical phenomena. In the later years, the visions were usually given during the hours of the night. And the visions given to her here in this home, and many of them were usually the visions of the night. It was in this room that Ellen White did very much of her writing. She would come to this room early in the morning, sometimes at midnight. Seldom did she remain in bed resting after a vision was given to her. So coming to the room, she would, after stirring up the fire and having a word of prayer, would be seated in a chair equipped with this lapboard and would do her writing in this corner, and she loved this corner. The story has grown up that when Ellen White was in vision, there was a supernatural light which could be seen from outside of the windows, but this is not sustained in fact at all. But working in this room very early in the morning, during those long, hard hours when the nurses at the sanitarium found it difficult to work, they could look out of the windows where they were, or the porch at the sanitarium, and see a light in Ellen White's writing room, in this window over there, or this window here. And it was the lamp light, of course, in the room to supply her needs, and it gave them a good feeling. Sister White was working too during those hard hours, and they could work.
This particular evening, when she retired early to her bedroom, she asked that the Lord would give her a good night's rest, although she felt very uncomfortable at the time herself. Her neuritis was bothering her, and her heart was acting up. And so she prayed the Lord would give her rest. When she first went to her bed, she turned this way and that way, trying to get her arm comfortable, but didn't seem to be able to succeed for some time. Finally, about probably 9 o'clock, she went to sleep, slept for a little while, and then waking, as we all do, to turn and move, she thought now she must move carefully so that the arm wouldn't hurt. Well, it started hurting again, but as she moved, she had a sensation of lightness. Not as the pain was gone. There was no pain. So she moved again, carefully, this way and that, and still the feeling of lightness persisted. And she thought that was wonderful, that the pain was gone, because it had been bothering her very much. And then as she was thinking about it, how wonderful that was, she noticed the room filling with a beautiful light, a beautiful azure light. Now that's kind of a blue, isn't it? Filling with a beautiful azure light. And as she was wondering what that might mean, a voice said, "Fear not, I am your Savior. Heavenly angels are all about you." Well, she thought, if heavenly angels are all about me, I must be in heaven. That's wonderful. No more messages to give, no more misunderstanding to endure. Now I can be at rest. And she had a wonderful feeling of restfulness and peace. The voice said, "Your work is not yet finished." So she knew she wasn't in heaven.
When we think of Ellen, a number of titles come spontaneously to mind. Messenger, writer, prophet. But would anyone ever claim she was perfect, above mistakes? The Bible records the shortcomings of its heroes and heroines, and history records there were occasions when Ellen looked back and felt she had made errors in judgment, in contrast with errors in counsel.
One time James and Ellen White had their pictures taken, and they were to go into a book, The Eminent Self-Made Men of Michigan, in 1878. They paid for the steel engravings and so on. Later, they felt that they had used money perhaps that should have been used of some other way. And they published a confession in the Review.
For 15 years, Ellen, her son Willie, and his family lived in the town of St. Helena, California. As their homes were a mere 3-minute walk apart, the lives of all were intimately entwined. Memories of Friday evening worship in Grandmother's home are still crystal clear to Grace and Arthur, as also are the morning worships in their own home.
So we usually had enough to have part singing, and Ellen White was very fond of music. We were just as quiet as worship as we were in church, not a word. And then my father would tell stories of the older days, or sometimes there would be a returned missionary staying over the weekend, and they would tell us stories about their experiences. Then after worship, we'd sung a hymn. Then we'd each get our Bibles and we studied the Sabbath school lesson. Then we could ask questions. Then we could move about, and we each took turns reading, answering a question. So we were involved in the after activity. Then for the younger ones, they played Bible games, and the adults played with them. We all did the same thing together. The little folks sat still while the adults had what they enjoyed, and then they joined in with the activities that we enjoyed. We were never pushed off into the corner. We were always a unit, a family, doing things together. Mother said to my father, well, we'll have a short worship this time, because it's a little late and the children have to be to school. And they had had breakfast still, you see. So he said, my father's very deliberate. He said, I shall read a psalm. So Mother just sat down. You know, he's going to do what he wants to do. Yeah. So he read the psalm that has 2 verses. Oh, that we had a wonderful time on Christmas. We took us weeks preparing the things, we children at our house. The Christmas trees were always at our house because there was always so much company here, and there wasn't a room that could be set off for just a Christmas tree. And we went out into the woods and found the best tree we could find, the most perfect one. It took us days to hunt through the woods to find it. We could go through Grandmother's forest, and we also had access to some of the others that you do not now. And when we get just the tree that we liked, then we'd mark it. And then when it was nearly Christmas time, we'd cut it and bring it and put it in the 3rd floor bedroom upstairs, which was 12 feet high, the ceiling. And the tree went to the ceiling.
As Ellen came to the close of her life, she did all she could to see that her personal finances were left in good order. But she had given so generously there was little left, despite the considerable royalties from her books over a span of 70 years. When her will was probated in Napa Court, a 3-man committee was assigned to assess the value of the estate. It was the manuscripts they found most difficult to value.
When my father, W.C. White, opened the vault door and said, gentlemen, here are the manuscripts, here are the records of the book properties, they didn't know what to do. They had to think in terms of what could you sell this for tomorrow at an auction. And so while there was a very large investment there, they just arbitrarily wrote down $40,000. And this, with the other assets, made some $64,000 in actual assets, and there were obligations of $96,000.
The General Conference advanced money to the White estate to pay off the debts and charged a reasonable interest rate on the loan. Over the years, the book royalties have more than cared for this expense.
Now there are royalties paid on the E.G. White books today. These royalties, by agreement, are the property of the General Conference. There is no member of the White family that benefits as much as 5 cents a year from the fact that Ellen G. White was an author. I was 7 years old when she died, and the event that stands out most clearly in my mind was her death and her funeral.
When the funeral came on, some of those very people to whom she went to visit and pray, they were at the funeral. Miss McIntyre told me that they would come in the side door of the house and go out through the parlor, out through the front door. once, twice, some of them 3 times, and she questioned them about it. Well, we just wanted to see once more the face of the dear old lady who came to our home to talk so nicely about the coming of Jesus and to give us literature and flowers and so on and so on.
A personality of such wide influence and varied responsibilities as Ellen White can hardly be evaluated in a few words. But there was one fact that lay at the foundation of all her work. It was her continual dependence on the Bible. This was evident wherever she spoke, from the largest camp meeting to daily worship in her own home.
We would come in and sit down quietly, and then we'd hear little footsteps coming down the stairs, and she'd come and sit in this chair that I'm sitting. That was her chair. And she would take the Bible. She knew just what she wanted to read. There was no time lost. There was no hurry, no stress, but she would just reverently take the Bible and read something that she knew we children would enjoy. Now, I never remember her reading anything but the Bible for worship time.
All through the following 14 years, or maybe 12, when she was out in the field here in California at camp meetings and general meetings, here and there, even in committee meetings, she carried her Bible and would use the Bible first before she talked.
She, in 1903, wrote that little heed is given to the Bible, and the Lord has given a lesser light to lead men and women to the greater light. She knew her Bible, and she made use of it, and she accepted it as the prime source of light. But as promised in the Bible, the Lord had given visions in our times to lead us to that word and to help us apply its principles.
Whenever I hear anyone say something like this, oh yes, Sister White did, past tense, a great work, I invariably say, my friend, Sister White not only did a great work, but she's doing a greater work today.
But she had written, whether or not my life is spared, my writings will constantly speak, and their work will go forward as long as time shall last.
Through the memories of Ellen's contemporaries, there emerges a portrait of a delightful Christian woman, one who was warm in her personal contacts, ever thoughtful of others' feelings, one who had a keen sense of humor, and was proud to walk the stairs of her home unaided, even at the age of 80 years, one who was always ready to help a neighbor, generous and full of faith in the Lord's work, thrifty and industrious in her own home, but above all, totally committed to her task as the Lord's messenger and totally convicted of his imminent return. She has been at rest for some decades, but her writings continue to speak.